It is wonderful to be with you this morning and to see friends that I know and to make new friends as well, hope to stay. Your congregational vision, would it be so across our country? And what a difference it would make. And the miracles, the little miracles that happen, such as at the Warming Center, would there be more and more little miracles to make the lives of so many people who need miracles in their lives so much better? I was invited to speak today, which is the day after the election, and perhaps many of us hoped it would be a different occasion as to what has happened. And I'm going to offer words of hope, but there is a realism here as well that I want to bring to the table from a historical perspective as a historian. And I also want to note that I did bring you, if you wish, feel free to take a copy of the magazine I edit for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. This is what it looks like. This is the October edition. There are copies on the front row. They're yours. As a matter of fact, if you know someone that might like it or could use it, feel free to pass them along as well. So this morning, I know that in this room, this day, there is a good deal of despair and disillusionment, of confusion and disbelief, and worry and fear. Many of us, alongside tens of millions of other Americans, have long poured our heart and soul and our very lives into helping create an America more inclusive and more just and more humane. But on this Tuesday past, we fell headlong into the reality that most voters are not all that concerned about an inclusive and just and humane America. Instead, in recent days, another path appealed to most voters, a path paved with dark and cruel and dangerous rhetoric, at least in part, accompanied by even sometimes threats of violence against Americans and immigrants who are not deemed worthy. Down that dark and dangerous path, our nation is now headed to some degree. I hope that January 6th, 2021 will not portend what may happen in the future. We are confronted with the reality that our nation, though having for generations gradually moved forward in so many ways, many of you over time have seen dramatic change forward for the good. But we are confronted with the reality that it can easily slip backwards as well, into shades of the 1950s opposition to the civil rights movement, which evidenced cruelty and hatred and even violence. We're also confronted with the reality that many good people, even some people close to us, are otherwise immersed in or dismissive of the cruelty and the hatred and the violence. And we're confronted with the reality that the cruelty and the hatred and the violence is largely driven by tens of millions of Americans who perceive themselves to be Christians, yet who seemingly have discarded the just, inclusive, and humane Jesus of the Gospels for an angry and hateful God. And I know that many of us are wondering, why? Why the cruelty? Why the hatred? And why the violence? But forgotten by most, yet within the lifetimes of some Americans living today, there was an earlier January the 6th during very dark days. At that time, Nazism, which itself was a far-right white Christian nationalist ideology, had Europe in its vice and was spreading far beyond. In the 1930s, in the name of God, and stoking fears of communism, German Nazism in that nation overthrew democracy, seized the press, and banned unapproved books, purged universities of liberals, banned abortions, persecuted, hunted down, and sometimes tortured homosexuals, and hunted down, arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately mass murdered some 6 million Jews. And during that time in our own nation, millions of citizens, in the name of a Christian America, and in opposition to Jews and communism, supported Hitler and his Nazis. Some formed citizen militias, training as stormtroopers to overthrow American democracy when given the signal. Twice, America's Nazis held massive overflowing rallies in Madison Square Garden. You can find YouTube's videos of this. The American flag and the swastika side by side. 20,000 men and women saluting Hitler in our nation. That was the background of January 6, 1941. And mere weeks prior, the United States had finally declared war on the Axis powers of Germany, Japan, and Italy, motivated to do so by a deadly Japanese attack on U.S. naval forces at Pearl Harbor. There was an awareness that Hitler was already exterminating Jews, and yet many in America did not want to get involved. It took Pearl Harbor for that to happen. And so on January 6, 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation. This was his annual address to the nation that he the context of his address. And his message was of an emerging America, more inclusive, more just, and more humane. But he also had a message of warning. The democratic way of life, Roosevelt told Americans, was imperiled by Nazism far and near, both. A healthy and strong democracy, FDR said, depends on some basic things. And I think at times like this, we need to remind ourselves, root ourselves in, stand upon some basic things. So here is a list of Roosevelt's 6 basic things for a healthy and strong democracy. 1, equality of opportunity for youth and for others. Jobs for those who can work. Security for those who need it. The ending of special privilege for the few. The preservation of civil liberties for all. The enjoyment of the fruits of scientific progress in a wider and constantly rising standard of living. I think that's worth saying again. I'm going to read those again. Equality of opportunity for youth and for others. Jobs for those who can work. Security for those who need it. The ending of special privilege for the few. The preservation of civil liberties for all. The enjoyment of the fruits of scientific progress in a wider and constantly rising standard of living. During the long, dark years of the Great Depression, Roosevelt's long-running administrations had, in fact, been working hard and with a great deal of success to achieve some of those basic things of a healthy and strong democracy. And Roosevelt's administration had done so by returning capitalism to its forgotten roots, greatly angering many of the nation's big corporations, many wealthy Americans, and America's Nazis who were demanding a Christian nation. For most Americans today, as in the 1930s, the hard reality is that personal economic circumstances are more important than democracy. This is in part why we're having this conversation today. In the 1932 election, American voters tossed aside sitting President Herbert Hoover because he had adamantly refused, to use federal monies to alleviate the abject poverty, the destitution, the hunger, the widespread joblessness, some 25% of people unemployed, workers unemployed, and the homelessness of millions of unemployed Americans who had done nothing. FDR won the 1932 presidential election in a landslide on a promise to rein in the excesses of unfettered capitalism that had led to the Great Depression, and to focus the federal government on alleviating poverty. Within weeks of when he took office, he began making true on his promise with the New Deal, a massive public works program to provide income for the destitute with jobs, a range of domestic programs to provide for the immediate and long-term needs of ordinary Americans, major financial reforms, and business regulations that reined in the excesses of corporations and gave more power to more working Americans. But FDR found opposition from many white Christian clergy who insisted that churches, not the federal government, should provide for the needs of the needy and impoverished in their communities, when in reality, the churches couldn't do it. It was too much. That same opposition to the federal government helping poor Americans remains among much of white Christianity today. But Roosevelt was merely returning capitalism to its roots. Now, many of us in college read, or maybe we tried or pretended to read, Adam Smith's famous book, Wealth of Nations, written in 1776. Smith today is widely perceived to be the father of unfettered capitalism, and his book, The Wealth of Nations, is perceived widely to be the Bible of unfettered capitalism. But I'm here to tell you today, none of that is true. In 1934, a young economist named Eli Ginsberg, who had just written a book about Adam Smith, wrote an article for the New York Times. Like Roosevelt's New Deal, Ginsberg wrote, Adam Smith's famous book, Wealth of Nations, seeks a generational redistribution of wealth downward, Ginsberg said. Adam Smith, in fact, had prescribed what I frame in a brief term, if you will, as empathetic capitalism, as the answer to the greatest problem faced by nations of old, in Smith's estimation. The problem of too much wealth accumulated in the hands of too few people. Does that sound familiar? Thus resulting in widespread poverty, unrest, and even revolution and the fall of nations. Adam Smith's empathetic capitalism, implemented to a significant degree by FDR in the 1930s, thank you. Adam Smith's empathetic capitalism, implemented to a significant degree by FDR in the 1930s, prescribed high taxes on the rich, extensive business regulations, especially on banks, living wages, what we would call living wages today, universal education, and limits on how much wealth could be handed down within families from generation to generation. Do you hear me here? Adam Smith said, when we talk about living wages, Adam Smith said, and he used the word the masses, that was a common phrase back then to describe the people. If the masses don't have enough food to eat, don't have adequate shelter over their head, and don't have adequate clothing, guess what happens? Revolutions happen. Adam Smith's empathetic capitalism was designed to expressly to eradicate poverty. And that is what FDR set out to do in the New Deal. But in 1980, Ronald Reagan, allied with big corporations, some of America's wealthiest families, and far-right white Christians, then known as the religious right or moral majority, promised to eradicate FDR's legacy of empathetic capitalism. Since that time, corporate interests have essentially controlled much of the legislation that comes out of Washington, D.C. They've written much of that legislation, and their money makes it pass. Legislation that decade after decade after decade has favored big corporations and wealthy individuals over middle class and lower class Americans. Legislation that further enriches the rich while smothering Roosevelt's ideal of an inclusive and uplifting, strong, and healthy democracy. Today, we are living in a world where CEO salaries are often hundreds or thousands of times more than that of the average worker. A world where good-paying jobs are less and less. A world where the economic security is non-existent for most Americans. A world where opportunities for a decent life are scarcer for many. A world in which corporate interest and money flowing from billionaires is steered to Christian nationalist organizations in a mutual quest to overthrow our inclusive and just and humane democracy that threatens the power of plutocrats and the theocratic goals of white Christian nationalists. This has contributed to where we are today. Today in our nation, a majority of Americans are left fighting for the pennies on the dollar that corporate interests have not hoovered up. And when so many Americans are struggling just to get by, many are understandably going to vote on the basis of their personal economic needs, democracy being of little concern to them. And this leaves us with questions. What do we do to transform such a world as this? Where do we find hope? At this moment in time, this very day, in these next 4 years, overcoming Christian nationalism and plutocracy both seems impossible, perhaps, right now. But there are signs of hope. I do feel fortunate to work for Americans United for Separation of Church and State, founded in 1947. It's a D.C. nonprofit. And we're on the front lines of fighting against Christian nationalism and the extremist anti-freedom, anti-democracy Project 2025. Many of you have heard of by now. That's funded by plutocrats and designed to destroy our democracy and install a plutocratic theocracy. And the incoming administration is planning on using that playbook. Right now, despite these most difficult of times, AU is leading the way in helping achieve victories, and there are some victories. AU was involved litigation-wise on the successful Missouri reproductive rights referendum, for example. There are many states right now that are trying to force Christianity into public schools. And we litigate each instance when that rises to a significant level. We are litigating those problems, that attempt by Christian nationalists to Christianize our public schools. As a historian, I have long believed that there are structural public keys to a victorious fight for inclusive, just, and humane democracy. And I do want to end by naming some of these. I do believe there are first freedoms, and that's in our First Amendment, where church and state is separated, and all Americans are equally guaranteed freedom of religion or no religion, and freedom of conscience for all. This protects all Americans' personal freedoms, and our First Amendment, first freedoms, must be defended. Science-based, common good, robustly funded public education. Could we have this? Including, in my estimation, advanced education access for all Americans, not just K through 12, but through college as well. College education today, as many of us I think know, is somewhat comparable to high school education a generation or two ago. It really is a must. How about empathetic capitalism that FDR evidenced which can equal, if implemented, and it was for a while, somewhat of an equitable economy. And far from least, voter education and involvement. In addition to voting for inclusive democracy each and every election, I believe we can personally and collectively resist Christian nationalism in the dark days that are probably going to lie ahead. There's some things we can do. I think we need to start, each of us, with ourselves to some degree. This is going to be a journey. For our mental well-being, we each can identify something that we treasure, a relationship, a hobby, something peaceful and meaningful and fulfilling, and hold on to it for our own sanity. We can educate our communities about the threat of Christian nationalism. This is something AU is helping to do in many communities across our nation, and I hope to do so more here in Bozeman as well. We can develop relationships with persons whom we perceive to be others, those others that voted differently than we do, that we think we can't have a conversation with. There are ways, and we must. I'm saying we must. The next edition of Church and State magazine, I have an article about that very thing. We can, in the midst of it all, maintain our faith in our common humanity and the common good. Not everyone may agree with us, but we can hold on to that and maintain our faith. And we can support organizations that are on the front lines, legal and advocacy front lines, in the battle against authoritarianism and for inclusive, life-sustaining democracy. Let me end with words loosely based on Roosevelt's January 6, 1941 message about the strong and healthy democracy for which we yearn. We seek human rights for all across our land. We struggle to gain those rights and to keep them. But we find strength in our unity of purpose. We do not lose hope. And ultimately, there will be more victories.